Good. Yes.
Drop the scaffolding. I mean, he's very lucky.
It is my pleasure to call us to order. Yeah, we have the distinct pleasure to welcome Allison Gopnik, visiting from our sister institution of at Berkeley. Allison is a professor of psychology at Berkeley and also of philosophy, which brings philosophers to this room, as I see my colleagues scattered about. We talked a little bit, we focused more on philosophy this morning, but the two topics are not unrelated. And so Allison's work has been groundbreaking in both child development, cognitive development, and particularly in learning, and learning changes across the ages. And that's something that we will continue to hear more about presentations this afternoon. Allison, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. And I've already had wonderful discussions before. As I was saying, I have a kind of sentimental attachment to Irvine because this was actually where we started doing a lot of the causal inference work 20 years ago when Clark Lemar was a visitor here and very closely related to the philosophers. So I feel very happy to be back again with, I hope, some new ideas and new interdisciplinary approaches that will be interesting to both philosophers and psychologists. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about the idea that there are multiple intelligences across development and that the balance between these multiple intelligences is part of what makes human beings intelligent overall, part of what makes us thrive. And let me start out, I usually have this first point in a separate slide, because when I present that to an AI audience, there's a sharp intake of breath in the audience. If you say there is no such thing, the great grail that you are all pursuing is just a phantasm, they get sort of upset. But I think for a cognitive science audience, it will be pretty obvious that outside of a few weird corners of psychometrics, cognitive scientists don't think in terms of some mystical general intelligence that you can have a little of or a lot of. They think about different kinds of cognitive capacities designed to solve different kinds of problems. And I think one of the things that's really come out of cognitive science is that there are often intrinsic trade-offs between these different kinds of cognitive capacities. One of the most famous trade-offs is one that I'll start out talking about, which is a trade-off between exploitation on the one hand and exploration on the other. People have talked about this particularly in the context of reinforcement learning, but it's a much, much more general point. Going back to Joanna Fitzpatrick, any kind of optimization problem is going to face this trade-off between exploration and exploitation. There's also a trade-off that I'm going to talk about between exploitation and exploration and a kind of care, teaching, transmission kind of intelligence. So the kind of intelligence that you need to care for another person and also to pass on information to that other person is quite different from the kind that you need if you're trying to act effectively in the world to exploit, and also different from the kind you need if you're trying to extract information from the world, the sort of explorer intelligence. So these are all quite different. And what I want to argue is that in human development, you can, to some extent, I mean, humans being what they are, all humans are doing all of these things to some extent, but I still think that you can map them onto various developmental periods, developmental ages. And part of this comes from thinking, and as will probably already be obvious, the thought is that exploitation is the kind of intelligence we typically think of when we think about adult planning, decision-making, resource extraction, and so forth. If you look at the literature on adult cognitive psychology, almost all of it is about things like decision-making and planning and reasoning. That's kind of the typical adult 35-year-old kind of intelligence. But that is in contrast with the kind of intelligence that involves just trying to learn as much as you can about the world as quickly and accurately as you can. That's the kind of exploration intelligence that I've argued is characteristic of children. And in turn, that's different from the kind of teaching transmission intelligence about trying to pass on the information that you've already got to other ages. And I should say, when I first started giving this talk, I was a little snarky about the exploitive adults, and I would say, you will be surprised to hear this, but like 35-year-old white male psychologists are quite convinced that this is like the real key to intelligence, right? Like this is the best possible peak of intelligence, and then development is just building up to it, and then aging is just falling off from this wonderful 35-year-old peak. And I would say, that doesn't make much sense from an evolutionary perspective. It was so great to be 35, you could just be born being 35, right? And stay that way until you died. Nowadays, when I make that point, and I say, you know, these really other very deeply human functions that we see much more vividly if we're looking at the children and we're looking at the grandmothers than we do when we're just looking at the 35-year-olds. One of my slogans is that we're really human up to puberty and after menopause. And in between, we're basically glorified primates. So in between, mostly what we're doing is getting mates and finding our way in the dominance hierarchy and extracting resources and doing all the things that the other primates do. And the really human stuff about theory formation and language and stories and culture, all that is what the grandmothers and the little kids are doing. So we're sort of off in the corner where fortunately the 35-year-olds aren't paying any attention. So that was my original snarky way of introducing this distinction.
Some quick technical thing. People on Zoom see your view of what you have in your laptop. Can you switch to the slide presentation?
I have the slide presentation.
She's running a slide presentation, yeah.
They have the presenter view, is that it?
Yeah, they have the presenter view like what I have.
Yeah, that happens sometimes with this. If you're okay with it, you can just continue. If you have things that you don't want to
No,
broadcast in
yeah,
there,
no
okay, then it
mysteries.
doesn't matter.
No
Yeah.
secrets.
Yes.
I don't know if you can hear me, but the only thing is that the slides are really small.
Okay,
For
let me
us.
see if I can just, do it a little bit differently. I don't.
You can select, when you share, you can select just the part that you want to display.
Oh, okay.
There's a way of doing that. I'm not sure I remember exactly, but if no one else is going to do it.
I know how to do it.
I don't know.
Yes, if someone knows how to do it. Yes, it's like a share setting. So when you're going to share, you don't just go new share.
I see, okay, there's
I
something.
think it might be have more. Share bands or something.
You're still sharing, so you have to stop sharing.
Oh, okay.
Stop sharing.
Yes.
And then-
Definitely stop sharing. And then when you go to ask to share, might minimize the.
That should be.
That was really, that's. So one more. Share screen, try that, see if it doesn't for any, try it. Desktop, see advanced there?
There we go.
And then you're gonna use that to like select just this part.
Portion of screen.
Yeah, so if you click on that and move over there, yeah, and this thing, move it over to where you're gonna display it. Even this is good actually, I can minimize it.
Yeah, okay.
That should do it. Is it working now?
Yes. Thank you. Okay, do I need to do anything else or now it's working?
No, I think you're good.
Okay, great, great. Okay, sorry. All right, so let me go on. So nowadays, when I'm doing this, I tend to be a little less snarky because I have a bunch of children who are 35 who have children, and I say, oh my God, those poor 35-year-olds, their life is such hell because all they're doing is doing all this primate stuff, and the children and the grandmothers get to do all the fun stuff. So, now, part of the reason for thinking about this is that this developmental trajectory where we have an extremely long childhood and this long old age is a very distinctive thing about us as human beings. And this is a general issue of the philosophical transactions that makes this point. It's what evolutionary biologists call life history. And life history is really important from an evolutionary perspective. So often animals are being selected for life histories rather than for other kinds of characteristics. And often their other characteristics are consequences of their life history. And human beings have an extremely strange life history. In particular, we have this exceptionally long childhood. So this is a chimp in the Gombe, and by the time this chimp is 7, he'll be consuming as much food as he's producing. He doesn't get any extra food from anybody after that. In our culture, in forager cultures, this is not true until people are at least in their teens, 15 or so, and in our culture, the 35-year-olds are still getting tuition and this is interesting because if you look across many different species, not just primates, but mammals and birds, and as it turns out, even insects, you see this very general relationship between this long period of immaturity and our kind of niche, large brain size, reliance on learning, what we think of as intelligence, flexibility. And the poster animals for this are actually like the New Caledonian crow on one side, the corvids in general, versus the galliforms like the chicken on the other side. And the chickens are mature in about 2 weeks. And it's interesting, there's just a recent study that came out from Justin Wood that showed that they essentially know everything they're going to know when they're born, chicks are born, and they won't revise. So even if they get evidence that says that the world is different from the way that they evolved to think it is, they don't do any kind of revision. In contrast, the crows can figure out how to function in many, many different kinds of environments, including doing things like using wires or sticks as tools. And you can see something like this in neural development too. So what you see is very characteristically across many different species, but very vividly in the case of humans, you have this early period when there's lots of synaptic connections are being formed. The brain's very plastic, it's very sensitive to experience. And then there's a kind of tipping point where the connections that have already been formed are myelinated, they become stronger, they become more efficient, and the ones that haven't been formed are pruned. So you start out with this brain that's very well designed for learning, it's very plastic, it can take in information from many different environments, not very good at putting on its snowsuit to go out to preschool in the morning. And then you have this later brain that's much more efficient and effective, can do things much better, but is much less plastic, is much less flexible. And this kind of architecture is something that you see all over the place. And it's interesting that you don't typically see it in AI applications, even when they're using neural networks, but it does seem to be an evolutionary architecture. Why would you see that? Okay, why would you see this relationship between a long period of immaturity, which is extremely costly? I mean, costly just in terms of calorie costs that it needs to keep those babies alive, even when the babies aren't contributing anything. Why would you see this pattern so generally? And of course, human beings were way off on the end of the distribution on all of these features. We have the largest brain, the longest immaturity. We survive in the widest range of different kinds of environments. And I think the answer to this comes from a different kind of project that I've been doing over a long time, which is trying to think about this computationally. And this is a lovely quote from Alan Turing, an old quote in the 1950 imitation paper, where Turing pointed out that you could try to simulate the adult mind, but that would just tell you something about how the adult mind is now. What you really want to have is a mind that could learn to think or to have various kinds of cognitive capacities from data and experience. And if you want that kind of mind, the place to look is at the children and not at the end. And that's what my colleagues and I have been trying to do really for 20 years, 25 years now, but especially in the last 5 years or so, where the big boom in understanding and thinking about machine learning has meant that people in AI are increasingly interested in learning in children and vice versa. So people like Barbara and Nadia and I who study learning in children are increasingly thinking about it in computational terms. And if you think about it in computational terms, go back to this idea about explore-exploit trade-offs, one of the things that comes out of the computational literature is that there's this foundational trade-off, as I mentioned, between exploration and exploitation. So the idea is, even if you can see this in reinforcement learning, but much more generally, in any kind of optimization problem, imagine you sort of have this big box of potential solutions to a problem, or say hypotheses about how the world works. You're at a particular point in this box. That's what you know now, what you think the right solution would be. You're trying to search through that space to find something else. One way you could search through that space is to just look in the local environment. You could make small changes to what you're doing now. You could see, does that make it better? You could use something like hill climbing to do that. And then if it makes it better, you move in that direction. The problem with doing that is that you could get stuck in a local optimum. So you could just find something that's kind of good enough and implement it quickly and efficiently. But maybe there's another solution that's actually much better, but it's much further away in the space. So another way that you could search through the space is you could bounce around the space, go from one part to another, try one thing, try something completely different. This isn't quite being outside of the box, but at least it's being in the inner the corners of the box, until you find something that looks like it's a good solution. And that has the advantage that you'll get to that further part of the space. It has the disadvantage that you're going to spend a lot of time on solutions that are actually completely ridiculous and aren't going to help you at all. And the way that people in very, very generally in computer science and optimality theory think about this is in terms of the temperature of a search. So the idea is you could have the local search is the low temperature kind of local search. Think about this box as if it has air molecules in it instead of hypotheses. Or you could have the high temperature search where there's a lot of randomness and noise and you're bouncing around the box much more. And I always sort of say, which one of those sounds like your 3-year-old? Is it the little careful thing that is just changing a little bit in the corner, or is it the big bouncy noisy thing? And it turns out that there's no way of optimizing both of these things at the same time. It's an intrinsic trade-off. But the common way that this, or one common way that this gets solved in machine learning is through something like what's called simulated annealing. So simulated annealing is start out with a high temperature search and then gradually cool off. You can see why that might work. You start out really exploring the space. You can get to places that have the unusual solutions, and then you settle into the right solution. So at the end, you're not bouncing around, you just settle on a single solution. And here's a very simple illustration of this. So this is just a very simple space where all you're trying to do is get to the best height of that line. And you start out here, but you can see that if you just looked on either side of where you are now, currently, if you just looked on either side of where you were currently, you wouldn't see any better solution. But if you look across the whole space, if you bounce around the space, you're going to find that there's actually a maximum that's further away. So you're going to look around, you're going to see that this is actually the best point. And now you don't want to keep wiggling around the space. Now you just settle in on that particular optimum. And this is an absolutely universal technique in machine learning. All the machine learning systems use this kind of technique. So my hypothesis is that childhood is evolution's way of performing simulated annealing. So childhood is a way of resolving this explore-exploit trade-off. You have an early period when you have this kind of a lot of high temperature search, and then you have this later exploit period. And one thing that's interesting from that perspective is that many things that are features from the explore perspective are bugs from the exploit perspective and vice versa. And a lot of things that people have traditionally thought of as limitations or problems in children's learning are actually features from the explore perspective. So the fact that children are noisy and variable and they produce a lot of random behavior, the fact that they take foolish risks, the fact that they're impulsive, the fact that they spend a lot of their time playing, that's almost by definition, not exploitation. That's like the definition of the fact that they're motivated by curiosity. All those are characteristics that are characteristic not just of human children, but of children in general, young animals in general compared to older animals. And they're all things that are features from this explore perspective, even if they're bugs from the exploit perspective. Well, could you actually demonstrate this? Well, exactly because grown-ups are better at exploitation and the skills that come with it, like executive function and planning than children. Most of the time, if you give children and adults a task, the adults will do better than the children. But there's a whole range of examples across a wide range of different kinds of domains of development where that's not true. And what all these examples have in common is that if the solution is unusual, unlikely, out in this weird part of the space, then children do better at it than adults do, and younger children do better at it than older children do. And I'm going to give you an example of this, one example of this from a recent study that I did with my student Emily Leawood, who's now at the University of New Hampshire. And we wanted to take a kind of classic task, which is an approach avoid task, and look at it developmentally. So here's how this task goes. A lot of the work that we've done has used this extremely wonderful and cheap machine, the blicket detector. Here's a little machine, and you can put a block on it, and you have to decide, do you want to put the block on or not? If you put the block on and it's a zap, so you approach it, what will happen is you'll get a nice smiley face and you'll get a sticker. But if you put the block on and it's not a zap, you will get a mean face and you'll lose 2 stickers. When I give this talk in Silicon Valley, which I have quite a bit, I usually say, think of this as being like 1 billion stickers and then that you will gain 2 billion stickers that you used. So get it. Get them to understand. All right, so now you've got an idea. You've seen that the spotted block is not a zap, it's leading to loss, and the striped block is something you should approach. Now you get another block. This is a black stripe block, and you put it on, and you see, oh, look, okay, I get a sticker, that one's a zap. Now, the crucial question is, what about when you get this block? Should you put it on the machine, or should you not put it on the machine? Okay, well, if you think that you've already worked out what the hypothesis is, right, you now know that stripes are good and spots are bad, you should avoid it because you're going to lose stickers. And in fact, that's exactly what grown-ups do. But as it turns out, the actual outcome in this case is that that was a zap. So the rule about what is a zap or not is a 2-dimensional rule instead of being a 1-dimensional rule. It's a somewhat more unusual rule where everything is a zap except the white spotted block. Okay, everybody kind of get that? Now, there's a bunch of experiments that have been done by Tagarekas and others that show that if you do this with adults, the adults end up in what's called a learning trap. So you can see how this would happen, right? If you never try that last block, you're never going to find out that you were wrong. And it's going to look as if your theory is being confirmed because, in fact, every time you try the simple box, you're going to get the same answer. And this is, some one of these things that we cover. Psychologists think is cool about learning traps, but this is actually also related to things like some kinds of pathologies. So if you think about anxiety disorders, for example, anxiety disorders are basically what happens when you're in a learning trap. Because you get on the plane once and you have a miserable experience, and then you say, I'm never getting on a plane again. You never get on a plane again. You never learn that actually most of the time planes are okay and there's things that you could do to cope with the planes. So this is kind of a mechanism for, among other things, anxiety disorders. Okay, what about when you do this with kids? Well, what we did was do this with adults, 6-year-olds and 4-year-olds. The adults behaved just like Rich and Garekis would suggest. They left a bunch of reward on the table, as it were, because they got stuck in this learning trap. The 6-year-olds were more likely to approach, and the 4-year-olds were very likely to approach. And if you have a 4-year-old and you think about this task and you say, is he going to try it or is he not going to try it? But 4-year-olds think it's cool to actually try it and see what happens. All right, well, that means that maybe it's just the 4-year-olds are impulsive, so they're impulsive. But when you look at what gets learned, you see that the 4-year-olds are learning much more than the adults are. So the number of people who learn now we ask them at the end, what's the rule? Is it this 2-dimensional rule or 1-dimensional rule? And the kids are actually better at learning the rule because they were willing to do the exploration. And in fact, were motivated to do the exploration. And there's a lovely study that came out, not from my lab, but from Eric Schultz and Charlie Wu recently, and Azura Ruggieri, who's a postdoc of mine, that showed that you could systematically show that this was the result of something like a more high temperature surge. That you could think about the developmental change as what's called stochastic optimization. You're going from a more high temperature surge to a lower temperature surge. Obviously, I was very pleased about. Okay, so that suggests that you have reason to believe that children really are optimized for exploration, but you'll notice that the kids end up losing stickers, right? So the grown-ups do better in this task, even though they're getting stuck in the learning trap. They're not getting as many stickers as they could in principle if they solve the problem. But in fact, in this experiment, the adults end up with more stickers than the kids do. So there's a real genuine cost to this trade-off. You do lose things if you go out and are impulsive and risk-taking and are trying to, are just trying to figure out what's going on in the world. And the solution to this, let me just backtrack for 1 minute and say something about how this relates to the earlier talk that I gave. So why are the children doing this? Why are they motivated to do this approach? And an argument that I've been making is that you could think about what they're doing as involving a reward in the reinforcement learning literature called empowerment. So empowerment is about trying to find the relationships between the actions that you perform and the outcomes that are a result of those actions. So it's an information gain measure, but it's an information gain measure specifically about actions and outcomes. It's not like any kind of information gain. And if you think about this approach avoid task, a good way to think about it is the kids are looking for the contingencies. They want to figure out what the contingency is between their action and the outcomes. And that overrides their desire to just have the higher value rewards, that just the simple. And I won't go into it, but I think you think about kids, that explains a lot of their behavior. And I'll give you another example of this. So they're not paying attention to the reward. The contingency is its own reward. Okay, but there's a catch to this, which is, as I say, there's cost. So how do you deal with the fact that there's going to be costs if you're exploring? And let me describe another experiment. This is one of my favorite experiments of all time that speaks to the way that we solve those that problem in evolution. This is another example of the kids seeking empowerment rather than seeking reward. It's an experiment that Nim Tottenham and Regina Sullivan did. The oldest finding in all of psychology: you put the rat in the maze, it goes down one arm, it gets shocked, goes down the other arm, nothing happens. It will not go down the arm that has the shock anymore, right? Like Psych 101, J.B. Watson. And also, by the way, the origin of all of reinforcement learning, right? All of reinforcement learning is basically based on that initial observation.
Well, it does take a few trials.
Yeah, okay, so you give them a few trials.
Yes, they're very noisy, the rats, but yeah.
Except it turns out there's an exception to this, which is if it's a juvenile rat. So if you do this with a juvenile rat, it's a little hard to tell how old rats are, apparently. Like, it might be anywhere from like a 2-year-old to a teenager, right? That it's a particular point in rat development. It's not at the very beginning, but it's a little later on, but still juvenile. They'll do the opposite. They'll actually go towards the shock. So what they're doing is trading off. And of course, the shock is where you get empowerment and information, right? Because that's how you learn that if you do this, if you perform this action, here's what the outcome of it is going to be. Going down the other arm isn't going to tell you anything, right? Nothing happens. But there's so that suggests this idea that the juveniles are looking for empowerment and information and exploration versus the adults. But there's a fascinating catch to this, which is the rats, and in Nim's work, 3-year-old kids will only do this if the mother was present at the time that they had the condition. So for the rats, it's like, well, even for rats or for rats, just the mother's presence, so just is there, you can smell her, is what enables them to do this. And if the caregiver or the mother isn't present, then they'll act like the adults. They'll avoid the other outcome. And that's also true for the 3- and 4-year-old children. So what's the solution to this problem about the trade-off? The solution seems to be moms or caregivers in general. So having caregiving is a way of resolving this explore-exploit trade-off. And one of the things that we know, to go back to the evolutionary, so what I've been doing, the other thing that I've been doing, aside from this work on empowerment and exploration, the other side of the coin is that depends on care. It depends on having people who can do this caregiving. And a big project that I've been doing is looking at the intelligence and ethics and politics and psychology and biology of care. And this is part of a big project that we have at the Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral Sciences, trying to do this in an interdisciplinary way. And I'll just briefly say, it's amazing. This is the most important thing in anybody's life that they ever do, that everyone thinks is the most profound, deepest, most morally difficult motivation that they have. And it's invisible in social science. It's go to political science, go to philosophy, go to cognitive science. You would never know that this isn't a really important part of human lives. You know, there are bits of it in various kinds of psychology, but certainly it has been invisible in cognitive science. There might be an explanation, which would be somewhat, as they say, ad hominem of why it is that this is true, but it is certainly true, and we're trying to fix it. From an evolutionary biology perspective, this feature of parental care is absolutely foundational. It's really, really important. And just as we see this correlation between long childhood and intelligence and brain size, you see a correlation between parental investment and intelligence and brain size. This is the poster animals for this example. These are actually marsupials. You see the same relationship between childhood and marsupials and brain size that you do for placental mammals. These are the quokkas. They're the world's cutest animals. They live on a little island off of in New Zealand. And this is a Virginia opossum. The possums and the quokkas are about the same size, the same overall weight. The possums, only the biological mother takes care of the babies. She has these very large litters all at one time, and the babies are mature within weeks, leave the mom. The quokka babies are staying in the pouch for as long as a year, and both the fathers and the mothers are involved in caring for the now, as I always say, you know, I think probably for human mothers, we often, that expression, the possum expression may capture our feelings more than the quokka expression. We could all use more backlighting in our lives. But we are obviously much more on the quokka end of the distribution. And not only are we more on the end of the quokka distribution, we're more on that end than any other primate. So if you look at even our closest primate relatives, like the chimps and bonobos, again, mostly it's the biological mother who's doing care in this early period until the baby becomes independent. If you look at humans from the time that we evolved in forager societies and fossil records, you see what I think of as this investment triple threat. You have fathers who are pair bonded and who are involved in parental care. Only 5% of mammals have pair bonded fathers. There's more of them in birds who also show this parental investment characteristic, and none of our close primate relatives have male pair bonding or care. That, by the way, is my son and my grandson. We have what the great anthropologist Sarah Hurdy calls alloparents, people who are not biologically related to babies, but who are still taking care of babies. A lovely example I have of this, and alloparents have been much more general, again, in forager societies. There's a study that shows that in, with these great behavioral ecology time use studies that show that in forager societies, the average baby is breastfed by 4 women in the course of a week, 4 different women, which really makes you think, oh yeah, I guess that's really averaging, right? And then we have my personal favorite, the post-menopausal grandmothers. And as we'll see in a minute, there's only very, very few mammals that have this phenomenon that humans have, and again, have had since we were foragers, of about 20 years post the end of fertility, where grandmothers are still very much alive and involved and engaged in the society. And grandfathers too, but the grandfathers seem to be somewhat sort of parasitic on the grandmothers side. But the grandmothers are the really striking thing from an evolutionary perspective, because they're not actually reproducing themselves anymore, but they're living for another 20 years longer, than, say, our closest primate relatives. And if you look behind those 3 beautiful children, you can see there's a grandmother lurking in the back. Okay, and there's some nice again, behavioral ecology evidence that in forager cultures, for example, the survival, especially of the toddlers, is completely dependent or is largely dependent on the grandmothers. So the mothers are taking care of the nursing babies, but then the grandmothers are taking care of the 2-year-olds, which because they're human, two-year-olds are still pretty completely helpless and dependent. An interesting side note, by the way, just at the conference about care that we just had, there was an evolutionary biologist, and he pointed out that if you do the modeling, the way that human life history works, keeping your babies alive is by far the most important thing you can do to have fitness. So all the other fitness things about, sleeping with lots of different partners and all that stuff is just trivial compared to the advantage in fitness that you get from just making sure that those babies survive. So there's nice evolutionary reasons why you would have this very wide-ranging, intense parental investment. And this investment depends on care. So it depends on doing this thing that we do very easily as humans, very naturally as humans, but that when you think about it is actually extremely strange. So if you think about your general picture of social, economic, political relationships in politics and economics and in psychology, the pair relationships are kind of weird. So they're very often rooted in these very specific local intimate relationships. Ashley Thomas, who used to be here as a graduate student, has some lovely examples of the fact that saliva sharing, actually who are you willing to lick an ice cream cone with is a really good indicator of who you care for. So they're rooted in these close relationships of love. They have a kind of transparency about them so that if you're caring for someone, you just care for them. And with children, this is particularly vivid, right? You have a baby, you have no idea what the features of the baby are going to be. The baby could be easy or difficult, or for that matter, could have a terrible disease, and it doesn't matter. You're still in a relationship of care to that person. And at the other end of the spectrum, your parents have dementia and they're fragile, and you still have the relationship of care. So it's a very different kind of relationship than, say, a typical social contract or reciprocal relation, where you really want the person that you're in the relationship with to be the sort of person who can reciprocate. It isn't even that you need them to be trustworthy. They're just there and you're caring for them. There's a fundamental asymmetry in care relationships. What makes it a care relationship is that the carer has more resources, more power, more opportunities for action than the cared for. And again, this is very vivid if you're thinking about it with children, but it also applies to other kinds of relationships of care, teachers, supervisors of graduate students, as Barbara and I were talking about, therapists. There's a very wide range of these elder care, people who are doing elder care. In all these cases, what makes it care is that there's this foundational asymmetry. And it's intrinsically altruistic. So what happens in all these cases is you're not actually expecting a reciprocal return. You're doing things to advance the interests of the person that you're caring for, in spite of the fact that they don't have resources that mean that they could reciprocate. Occasionally, people who don't have children will tell me, oh yeah, you're doing this so your children will take care of you later on in life. But any of you who do have children will testify that this is not the story. So one thing that we've been doing recently is trying to look at this from a formal perspective. You think about it in terms of modeling. We just had this meeting at CASPAS, was really interesting about this. So here's a very crude first pass at trying to think about a model of this kind of relationship. So let's think very generally from a kind of agent utility theory. You have agents, they have goals, they have utilities, they have resources. Classic way of thinking about social relationships. And now you have two of them, right? So agent A has different resources and goals than agent B. What are they going to do when they interact with one another? And the absolutely classic story is that it's going to be a social contract. And this is in biology, this is the explanation for altruism. This is literally all of economics is based on this idea. Most of political science is based on this idea. So what happens is A and B exchange their resources so that they can achieve each other's goals and they escape from prisoner's dilemmas and everything is lovely in the play capitalist garden. Another thing that could happen is that you could have a kind of solidarity. So A and B could just become a single unit. So they could pool resources, pool goals. You could think about them as just a single unit. But caregiving, so caregiving is not like that, right? Caregiving has this kind of asymmetry that means that it's not like a social contract. It's also not really like a solidarity relation because not only are these asymmetries, but the person who's the caregiver has different goals than the person who's being cared for. And it isn't like what happens is that those just are amalgamated into one set of goals. You don't have the same goals as your baby, but you think that you should do things that would help the baby objectively or subjectively to accomplish those each. Another kind of relationship you could have is a power relationship. That's the most obvious one when A has more resources than B. A has more resources than B, and so B subordinates their goals to A. So that's like being an employer, right? So you're an employer, you have the company, you have the money, you hire someone, you say, I want you to, this is like principal agent problems in economics, have this kind of structure. I want you to do the things that will advance my goals, and in return, I'll give you resources to advance your goals. None of those are good descriptions of care relations, because what happens in care relations is there is this asymmetry. A has more resources and power than B, but for that very reason, A subordinates their goals to the goals of B. So it's care because you've got, the very helplessness of the baby is the thing that calls out the caring relationship. And again, it's not just true for babies. If you think about elder care, for example, or care for people who are ill, it's exactly the fact that they need someone to take care of them. They can't accomplish the goals for themselves. That is the thing that's the motivation for their caring behavior. So it's got a really distinctive structure, which is very widespread, I would argue, and very different from the typical kinds of economic and kind of game theoretic structures, among others, that people talk about. Okay, why would you have this particular kind of structure? Why would you have creatures that behave in this way? And I'm going to suggest two different functions that this kind of care structure could have. One of them is that go back to the explore-exploit trade-off, as I mentioned in that lovely study from Nim Tottenham and Regina Sullivan. Having a secure base, having someone who's taking care of your utilities for you seems to be a prerequisite for exploration. So if you want to have these creatures that are, especially if they're creatures that are really designed to explore. So it's not just like in the typical RL model where, on a particular trial, you're trying to decide, do you want to explore or exploit? These are creatures who are just exploring all the time, AKA 3-year-olds, right? Well, how do you deal with that situation? So if I'm right that there's this very general evolutionary strategy of explore first and then exploit later, start out high temperature and then become low temperature, then having a care relation is a really good way of allowing that developmental framework to develop. And this is a bit of a just so story, but it's actually the philosopher Patricia Churchland has argued for this as well. A good way of thinking about this, I think, is it has its origins in both mammalian and bird caregiving, right? So especially if you think about the mammalian case, any mammal, and it's funny that we don't think about this way, every mammal mother is giving up her life for her babies, right? I mean, literally, she's giving up calories that she could be using to build up her own organism, right, to this other organism. That's just the nature of the beast. That's what it means to be a mammal. And in the case of the mammals, there's a very straightforward explanation for why that's true. We all see how this would be adaptive, but it requires a bunch of neurological and hormonal and cognitive architecture that actually enables this to take place. And we actually know quite a lot about how this happens in, say, rodent mothers. We know that there's oxytocin and vasopressin, and we know something about the genes that are expressed, and we know something about how this happens. And my picture is that once you've got this basic apparatus in place in this very straightforward adaptive context of mammals and also birds, then you can start using it for all these other purposes. So we know that exactly the same machinery gets used for pair bonding. So if you think about montane voles, for example, who are pair bonded, I can never remember if it's the montane or the pair. One kind of vole is a pair bond, the other kind of vole isn't pair bonded. The ones that are pair bonded look a lot like the mothers of babies. There's a beautiful, beautiful recent study. Sarah Hurdy has this lovely new book called Father Time about fathers. And she describes these kind of remarkable studies of gay men who are adopting babies now, something that has not been prevalent in our past evolutionary history. And what you see is that the gay fathers who are caring for babies start also showing the same kinds of patterns of brain activation and hormonal activation that you see in biological mothers. So there's something about this apparatus that seems to be something that's coming up in the context. And then I think for humans, it can be exacted to be, care for the planet or care for the past or care for nature, et cetera. And in fact, I was talking about this earlier today. It's interesting that this very different literature, which is this literature about early adversity and its long-term effects on human thriving, which I must say is sort of a startling literature to me. If you'd asked me 20 years ago, in fact, I said 20 years ago, no, it's a really complicated story about how early life is related to later life. And there's cascades and complications. You wouldn't really expect that what happens to you in the first 3 years would have a really predictable effect on what you're like when you're 50. I was totally wrong. It turns out that what happens to you is like one of the clearest, most scientifically supported examples in social science that these early adverse experiences end up having effects much later in life. And interestingly, in many circumstances actually have more effects later on than they do in the immediate period afterwards. So Aaron and I were talking about this morning. So if you look at like the preschool enrichment studies, when they first started studies of the effect of having high quality preschool, they said, oh, see, they all fade out by the time the kids are in fourth grade. Their scores are exactly like the other scores. But then it turns out that if you look at the 30-year-olds are, more likely to have a good job and more likely to go to college and less likely to have depression or anxiety. So there's something that's going on there that's extremely powerful. And it's about what that early context of care does for you. And William Franken, who studied early adversity and is also a biological modeler, have made the suggestion that one thing that early adversity may do is give you a cue that resources are going to be scarce, or that the environment is going to be unpredictable, and therefore there's no point in exploring. And there is nice biological evidence that what it does is accelerate this explore-exploit shift. So it actually, for instance, accelerates brain development, which again is kind of counterintuitive. So what it does is puts you into this exploit mode faster than you would if you had a more supportive, nurturing care environment. Okay. And let me just briefly go through, as I was saying to people earlier today, even though I'm an affiliate in philosophy and I sort of feel like philosophy is my natural home, I feel a moral obligation to do experiments when I have an idea. I feel like if I don't do the experiments, it's just talk, right? You could be a philosopher and you could just do talk for your whole life. That would be good. So this is a first pass at an experiment that's looking at this, looking at some of these aspects. And one of the other things that's really interesting in cognitive science, and developmental cognitive science in particular, is we have a whole literature that, I was one of the people who started this back in 1986 about children's theory of mind, about what they think about the mind. And it turns out that's really important and has lots of consequences. We have a more recent whole literature about children's intuitive sociology. What do they think about hierarchy? What do they think about social groups? So it turns out to be really important. The thing that is the most important thing in children's lives, that they experience the most, that's the most important for their survival, is caregiving. We have no idea what children think about caregiving. There's no studies of children's conceptions of caregiving. So we thought, well, okay, I can do something to contribute to this. So here's our very first study. So what I've just suggested is if it's true that caregiving allows for exploration, is that something that children actually think is true in the third person case as well? So we have a bunch of, it's all pre-registered. We have 6 to 8 year olds, and then we have adults tested on prolific. And we give them a bunch of these different vignettes where either you're playing with a mom around or you're playing by yourself. And they all involve explore-exploit trade-offs. So you're at the farmer's market, you could choose the apple. This is a classic explore-exploit example. You could choose the apple that you know is delicious. Here's this other weird kind of fruit. You don't know whether it's good or not. Which one should you choose? Or you're in the playground and you could go on the low slide that you've always gone on that you know is fun, or you could go on the high slide and you're not sure about it. It could be fun or it could be scary. Which one are you going to go on? And I kind of like this because I don't think the intuitions about this are obvious, right? Like you might think, well, if mom's there, she's going to get mad at me if I do the thing that's the risky, dangerous thing. So I'm less likely to do it. But both the kids and the adults very consistently have the intuition that you're more likely to explore if the parent is possible. It's not 100%, and it's an interesting question about what the individual differences might be, but it's a very consistent pattern. And it's true whether or not the person actually has children, among the adults, whether they have children or not. Yeah, Mike?
Just really quick, is the adult always a parent? It's always a known caregiver. It's not like a.
Yeah, so the next experiment too is, how about if it's just an adult of another kid who's in the park?
Right,
Or how about
saving
it's
from like catastrophe, but.
Yeah,
not
exactly.
a caregiver.
Exactly. That's the next thing that we want, or if it's a teacher, or if it's, and our sort of general principle is we want to do a whole bunch of experiments like this about care and then try and see if it's a professional caregiver, if it's someone who you're intimate with, how do those kinds of variants change your decisions about what you think the effect of the care is going to be, or the relationship. Yeah.
Might also be interesting to look if there's another child present.
Yes, that's right. That's another thing. Or an older child or a younger child. Exactly. And I think one of the things and we also asked for like free responses about what you think about this. And one of the things that I think is a really important point is that we don't emphasize enough the fact that in most cultures, older siblings are the ones who are doing most of it. So we tend to sort of ignore that. And I think it's really important to pay attention to that. All right, let me just mention the last thing about care, which is one function of care is to allow exploration, but another function of care is to allow us to be in the cultural niche, which is very characteristic of people. So we know that one of the things that humans are cognitively make humans, this is Joe Henrich's point, this is Boyd and Richardson's point, is the fact that we can get information from previous generations. That's one of the central things that makes us as intelligent and adaptive as we are. And I'll just bracket here, one of the things I've been arguing recently is that, for example, large models in AI are not intelligent agents as they tend to be conceived of, but they're another technology that lets us extract more information from a wider range of agents. And those kinds of technologies, that ability to get information from other people, have changed as we've developed, and they've had enormous impacts, arguably more important impacts than any other kind of technology on what we could do and how we could function. So we know that this is really a distinctive feature of humans. And if you look again at this, I chose this picture originally because it's such a nice picture. But actually what the grandmother in this picture is doing is reading a 100-year-old copy of Winnie the Pooh, a first edition of Winnie the Pooh, because she's a grandmother who collects first editions of old children's books to these children. So in fact, what's happening in this picture is that these children are getting 100 years worth of cultural knowledge in the course of having this cozy, intimate interaction with their grandmother. Now, that's a nice sentimental story about me and my grandchildren, but it turns out that this is very generally characteristic. And as I mentioned, we're almost the only mammal who has postmenopausal grandmothers. The other one is the orcas, the killer whales. And there's a couple of other cetaceans that seem to have this feature. And there's beautiful, beautiful recent work about these orca grandmothers who live, again, for 20 years. Turns out the success of the pod depends on having the grandmother present. You're much more likely to survive. And what the grandmothers do is pass on cultural information. So orcas are among the few other mammals that have clear cultural traditions. The mothers, in particular, the grandmothers are passing on foraging and feeding. So the grandmothers, especially when food gets scarce, the grandmothers can lead the group over to another place where there was food, there were food sources in the past when the grandmother was around and the babies were not around. So in addition to telling stories, the grandmothers are passing on recipes, which I really like. I think that's a good description of grandmothers. And Michael Gervan has shown that in lots of forager societies, it's actually not the parents, but the elders, the grandparents, who are passing on important information about how the society works. So if you look at, again, think about this developmental division of labor. If you look at hunting, hunting is really hard. It takes a long time to learn. It's not till you're about 35 that you get to be a really effective hunter. One of the things that you know is that, but how do you learn that, right? Well, someone has to teach you. And if you've ever tried, making pancakes with your grandchildren on a Sunday morning, or even a child, that trying to do something when there's also a child who's observing you is not the most efficient way of actually accomplishing things. And what Michael found is across many different societies, what happens is the 35-year-olds go out hunting by themselves. They're the strongest and most effective hunters. And then the 14-year-olds and the grandfathers go out hunting together. So they're not bringing back nearly as much food, but in the course of doing the hunting, the grandfathers are passing on children. So this is another kind of function that care can serve, in my last slide. So the general moral of this, and I've been applying this as well in AI contexts, is that this kind of developmental diversity and trade-off is really a condition for the kind of human intelligence that we have. That instead of thinking about intelligence, we should think about intelligences, and even more importantly, in a way, the relationships between the intelligences that are subsumed by social relationships like care or transmission or teaching are the secret, right? They're the thing that actually makes us be adaptive to the environment. And it's interesting that if you look at the AI literature, that's kind of invisible. That's not something that's there very much. There's one simple relationship. I sometimes say it's like the poor AIs have these super helicopter moms who are just trying to get them to maximize a single optimization function, a single reward function. And they're really good at doing that. Like they get great scores on their SATs, but they don't know how to do their own laundry, right? That's sort of the picture of RL agents. And the thought, this is a picture from a marvelous novella by the science fiction writer Ted Chiang, and I had a great kind of podcast conversation with him where he imagines what would happen if you were really raising an artificial intelligence. And he points out that all the same kinds of complexities that come in our caregiving for children are things that would come up if you were trying to think about an AI intelligence that could actually go out into the world and extract information and do the kinds of things that humans do. We have the same kinds of issues and problems about how do you care for a system that's like that? How do you allow them to be autonomous enough to have their own goals and yet have those goals not be, turn everybody into paperclips? And I think if you wanted to actually solve those problems, the way to solve them would be to have something like a notion of care even in the AI context. Okay, so I've gone long. Let me end as we usually do by, I always think the way to acknowledge this is these are all the children and then there's all the grandparents. So it's all the children who are actually exploring and figuring all these things out. And then there's the grandparents, AKA the funding agents that are providing the resources and, going out into the back 40 and digging up the roots that allow us to do this. So let me stop there and see if we have some time, little time for questions.
Do have 10 minutes for questions on the ballot. And we'll start with Dan.
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting that you've got there's these three sorts of roles that are important: exploring, exploiting, caring. I think it sounds like you're including teaching and some sort of caring there. But now I wonder if we didn't have like animals with an 80-year life cycle, so that so it makes sense to go through all three phases sequentially. Would it be able to work if you had sort of three types of entities that
Yes,
were collectively
yeah,
there?
exactly. So I think if you look at bees, insects, for example, another way to try and solve this problem is to do it with a division of labor. So
Yeah.
you have the scouts that are doing exploring. Apparently, there's even like 5 or 6 different kinds of scouts who are exploring in different ways. And then you have the queens and the workers who are actually exploiting. This is pure speculation, but I like this example. Cephalopods are a real exception to this because octopuses, right, have a very short life, a year. They don't have any childhood at all, and yet they seem to be very intelligent. And my just so story about this is, but if you look at their neural structure, they've got a central brain, right? One of the things that makes them really weird is, and then they have these 8 separate brains that are the brains that are in each of their arms. And the arms actually are wandering around and exploring, and the head is doing the decision making. So I sort of think like my picture of the octopus is it's like, when you see the preschool teachers with all the kids on the end there. Like, I think that must be what it feels like to be an octopus, right? Like there's the part of you that's trying to get food, and then there's all these other little arms that you have to deal with that are going out and trying to explore things. As I say, that's a just so story, but that's kind of the idea. And to some extent, right, like you could argue that our prefrontal lobes are like that central octopus head, right? We're sort of doing that. So even internally, we have some of this division of labor. But I think now, one thing that's great about the developmental solution is you don't have to worry about free riders, right? Because it's you. So you get the benefit of your exploration without having to worry that, the scientists are using the taxpayers' money and then the taxpayers aren't getting anything out of it. So I think that might be a good reason for having that as the particular solution.
Yes. Do you think that midlife crisis is just a temporary re-entering childhood again?
I don't think so. I think that, so there's two interesting questions. Adolescence, I think there's very good evidence that that's a rebirth of plasticity in the social realm. And we have evidence for that, and there's neuroscience evidence for that. So I think one thing that happens when I said annealing, you talk to the machine learning people. One thing that's interesting is if you say, how does the annealing schedule work? They say, well, you fiddle the knobs until it does the thing that you want it to do. There's no general theory about how annealing should work. But often what happens is you cool it off and then you heat it up again. And I think adolescence is an example where in the social world, you get this rebirth of plasticity and flexibility, and that's responsible for innovation, especially social innovation. And we actually have some data. A really interesting question that people have had is, if you're looking at the elders, one thing that is true, I think, is the elders get kind of released from prefrontal control, and there's evidence for that. And again, that's usually seen as being a deficit. They're not showing as much executive function. There's not as much prefrontal control over the rest of the brain. But there's also some evidence that they reap some of the same advantages. We reap some of the same advantages that the children have in terms of having a broader capacity for extracting information. Now, whether that's true whether that's just a kind of epiphenomenon of the fact that you're not in what I think is definitely true is the sort of Maya, as the Buddhists would say, the sort of Maya 35-year-old state where you have an extremely strong sense of self, you're narrowly focused, you're trying to get things, that's being released when you're in the elder phase. And there's beautiful information that shows, for instance, that elders are literally more interested in other people's utilities than they are in their own. And that's a really clear thing that changes around 50. So if you have a lovely experiment, you have a dynamometer, this thing that you squeeze, and depending on how hard you squeeze it, either you're going to get a reward for someone else or you're going to get a reward for yourself. If you're under 55, you squeeze it harder for yourself than you do for the other person. You don't even have like any measurement of it. It's just how hard you're going to squeeze. If you're over 55, you squeeze more for the other person, even just an anonymous other person, than you do for yourself. So I think the question of whether you're broader or more plastic is probably not true, but you do seem to have this kind of greater altruism later on. And you are, I think in a way, like being released from, you can see this is the positive view of elders, being released from the demands of adulthood might enable you to be more creative and wide ranging just sort of automatically, even if the explorer function isn't the primary function that you have later. Yeah, no? Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go right ahead.
Yeah.
There are two questions, right?
Right.
Also related to what we discussed earlier, simulated annealing, as we say, it's an stochastic optimization. So what is the objective function that we're optimizing? And if it changes throughout the lifespan, shouldn't we be doing, annealing throughout the lifespan?
Yeah, so that's a good point. And I think, speaking to your point, I think there's some really interesting evidence that even in adulthood, but here's what I think is interesting. Even in adulthood, we actually have cultural conventions, like going to the Center for Advanced Studies for a year, or having a sabbatical, or taking LSD, that have the effect in a particular. And I could give a whole talk about the parallels between what happens in psychedelics and what happens. I mean, I think there's lots of people think psychedelics, for instance, ramp up temperature. That's a good description. So I think as adults we do that, but it's kind of interesting that we do that by having a period of time that's very, and we, have mystical experiences and we stay up all night, we do all sorts of things like that, but we do it in a particular context where it's separated from the exploit functions, as it should be.
We invest in the stock market, things like that are like maybe a little bit more rational, but also require some exploration.
Investing in the stock market?
Yeah, as adults.
As adults. But I think the difference is as adults, we're doing it the way that people do it in RL, where we're saying, oh, okay, well, if I do this exploration bonus, then I'm going to get utilities later on. Whereas the 4-year-olds, they're just putting the blocks on because they like to put the blocks on and they want to see what happens. So again, it's true that we can do explore exploit trade-offs in the context of exploitation as adults. We kind of have to do that. But that's different than this thing that I think we also do, which is just put ourselves in a novel situation where we're going to ramp up our general plasticity and our general search temperature. And I think we do that. We do that as well, but not as effectively as the kids do.
Okay, we have time for one question. Nina?
Quick off the mark here, sociologist asking, if care is about a relationship where A has more resources than B. And in society, we generally see that care is undervalued and a lot of people who are giving care have less resources. I wanted you to think a little bit, is that then not genuine care? Or how do you think about that paradox when in reality, people who give care are much less resourced than those who often receive it?
Well, so that's a really interesting point. And there's an interesting argument in the economic literature that one of the paradoxes is when you talk to people who are involved in caregiving, one of the things that they say is, look, it's intrinsically satisfying. I'm doing this work and I'm willing to do it even though the pay is lousy and the conditions are lousy because I'm caring for another person and that's really satisfying. The example of this that I always find kind of heartbreaking is during the pandemic when they did interviews with the nursing home aides who were literally putting their lives at risk. What they said, and it's interesting in terms of this locality point, they said, well, look, it's Mr. Smith, right? It's old Mr. Smith. I've been taking care of him for 10 years. I can't let him die by himself, right? That would just be horrible. But of course, the result of that is that because it's got this kind of intrinsic motivation, and this is true with parents as well, because it's got this intrinsic motivation, it falls out of it's a bad bargaining position to be in from the perspective of a broader economic system. And a real question to ask is how can you provide those resources when the usual kind of mechanisms for getting resources, which are things like bargaining and having a social contract and using implemented power, aren't the right ones given the kind of relationship that it's.
Jack is gonna let me he's very nice and he's gonna let me ask Noga's question in a different way, super quickly. I'm just trying to.
You did all the work for this.
Yes, exactly. I have to serve this one. That's the question, exactly. So maybe this is not what you meant, but this is how I'm thinking about it. So very clearly, babies act randomly.
Right.
Because the human brain is complex and takes a long time to build. And very clearly that requires caregivers and all kinds of mechanisms for investment, whether it's oxytocin or you're working as a caregiver, which we also have. But I don't think it's clear that that randomness is adaptive in its own right. And that seems to be part of your argument.
Yeah, but I think, I mean, exactly, if you look at, it's not obvious that that randomness is adaptive, and you might think it was non-adaptive, but if you're thinking about it from this kind of explore-exploit perspective, one of the things now, exploration isn't always random, but very often there's an element of noise. So that's
Uncertainty-based, which is the other kind of major approach, like sampling stuff you haven't sampled or stuff that, you know, where there's not a lot of uncertainty, which in a volatile environment, you can sample a lot and still have uncertainty. But yeah, those approaches seem very different from what you're talking about. And I think one issue is that you're sampling a lot, but you're also acting randomly. And again, only when the caregiver is there. But still, I'm just wondering, like, if outside of experiments where you really put something in there for them to discover, there really is like a lot of important information hiding in that random.
well, here's an example.
It's related.
The best story that I know about this is if you look at motor development. So if you look at perinatal stuff about walking, that's a really nice case where she really beautifully tracks the fact that as I was saying before, like the babies are falling like 10 times a minute early on. And she tracks the way that having this variation to begin with means that you end up with this very adaptive, robust walking, which can deal with.
But that's risk taking. They fall and then they get up and they still do.
But it's also just the variant. It's also just the variance in the actions that they're producing, right? So they're producing a wider range to begin with, and you can see this in language acquisition too, where you get the babies are initially having this much wider range of phonological capacities, both in action and when they're adopting them. Now, I think the great challenge is it can't just be annealing. It's not just that you start out being random, because a lot of the exploration is directed, and we have good evidence for that, and we have lots of evidence for that with kids. So there's some interesting midway between the kind of exploration that is just, I know what the exploitation, I know what the reward is going to be. So this is what I should do to explore, because here's what I want for the whole, I think of this as the tech bros taking small doses, microdosing. Like the tech bros microdosing, is that an example of that kind of exploration, right? So I'm going to microdose so I can, get a better valuation because I know that will let me explore and be more creative, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is you're just crazy and random and noisy, right? And somewhere in between is where the kids are. So the kids are producing a wider variety. I think especially in this empowerment context, one of the things that you need to do to maximize empowerment and not get stuck is produce a very wide range of actions. And I think some of what looks like noisy random behavior on the part of, and it's never, it's not completely random in the way it is in robots, for example.
Well, it depends on how you model it. I see what you're saying. Yeah, it could be adaptive.
That could give you a range, that gives you a wider range of potential actions that you could take, and then that enables you to work out what the consequences of those actions.
Okay. You heard me.